I thought we were recording for the last 10 minutes and we haven't been. So there's that.
Yeah.
Were you recording? Because I gave you permission.
No, and I didn't even think about it. That's
Okay.
how bad. So now we're both recording.
Okay. Well, that was kind of lame.
Well, was that a great podcast, or was that? I think
Yeah.
that was the best podcast ever. And if you're wondering what we're talking about, we've recorded for however many minutes, not that long, really. Then realized, oh no, we didn't record. So you missed. Oh, I said such wonderful things. Tim, oh, we were back and forth, the banter. Brilliant. But unfortunately, nobody heard it.
Well, this is This Week in Common Sense. You're Paul Jacob. You're going to talk about the big stories of the week that have occurred in the first week of February 2022. And the first one is the anti-free speech boycott from January 31st.
Yes, and this probably got the most attention of any of the pieces. I think it's kind of the hottest issue this week, probably. Is this whole thing between Spotify and Neil Young and Joe Rogan. And see, this time I didn't have my senior moment where I don't know what I call Joe Rogan, but it's such a difficult name, Rogan. Anyway, but I happen to be a lover of Spotify. My oldest daughter, for Christmas, whatever, for just being a good dad, something. She has a family membership and a certain number of people. I'm one of her people. It's so wonderful. I love Spotify. I have about 6,000 songs I've liked. Can't play an instrument, can't read music, don't know anything about music except I love it, all kinds. And so Spotify has been a wonderful thing for me. So I'm prejudiced here. I already like them going in, but the truth is, I really like Neil Young, and I don't know him personally, but I like his music. The guy wrote Ohio, For Dead in Ohio. How can you run when you know? I mean, this is important, and so I like Neil Young too. I am on the side of Spotify. And this was called the anti-free speech boycott. I had a friend who happens to think that Rogan, interviewing guests who say things against the vaccines or that create doubt is a terrible thing, and is on the other side. And he argued, and I'd be willing to stipulate probably that let's just call it the anti-speech boycott. Because at the end of the day, nobody in this commentary and in other things that we talk about this quite often, because the attack on free speech, not just in Beijing, but in Washington and Silicon Valley and other places, is a serious problem. But here, we're not alleging anyone's violating anyone else's First Amendment rights to free speech. What we're alleging, in essence, is that they're violating the sensibility I have, and I think people should have, that we want speech, that we need the ability to debate, the ability for the dissenter to speak and say stuff that the authorities don't like, that cuts against the official narrative. And the more we try to hammer that out of existence, even if done in a way that violates no one's rights legally, but a way that means that we keep our mouth shut from now on. And that anytime we want to say something against the official narrative, there's just no place to say it. That's not the world I want to live in. And you can get there in a totally, we didn't violate the law, although I think there's all kinds of violations of the law in the big picture here. But I'm just saying, I'm not on Neil Young's side here, because he's trying to stop speech. And if I thought this was screaming fire in a crowded theater where there was no fire, I guess I'd be less fond of it. But the truth is, if you're not willing to allow people to interview guests who are controversial, to hear the other side of some opinion about medicine or politics or whatever, we're going to live in a world that's stupider, much stupider that isn't able to grapple with new problems because somebody makes a decision about what it is and everybody else falls in line. That's not the society that I want to live in. And so that, I think this is an issue that keeps coming up. And I was going to just mention this and breeze by, but it's probably worth spending a few minutes about it. It is something you're going to see more artists do this and more, fights like this. And I think even when there's not a principle in law that is being dealt with, there is the principle of we want robust debate and speech. And the idea that you're cutting against the official narrative means exactly zip to me.
Well, I kind of look at it like this. I look at it that we have the open arena of ideas where free speech would be, where it's not prohibited by some mechanism of any kind. And then we have safe spaces. I'm for safe spaces and I'm for arenas. And I don't like it when arenas like Spotify pretend to be safe spaces or when safe spaces pretend to be arenas. Every home in a sense is a safe space. You basically, in your church or your mosque, you say what you want to say, but you don't give outsiders equal rights. That's just absurd. That's a safe space, just like homes are, like your apartment is, your bedroom. That's a safe space. And that's my property rights. But then we also set up the arena. The arena could be just the world at large. I mean, and that's the idea with the First Amendment rights. When you say that no rights are being abrogated when this Neil Young thing happened, that may be true. Though our politicians have been encouraging this. This last week, they've encouraged that Spotify crack down on misinformation and disinformation.
There's a lot of walking on the borderline and over the line and so on. Yeah. And we've mentioned the financial involvement with the government and some of these social media platforms and so on.
But all I'm saying is that free speech should be somewhere, okay? And it shouldn't be just in a bunch of safe spaces. That is, the only place I get to say what I want to say is in my home. I can't use, social media or in this case, a networking service to speak my mind. That seems like that would be very bad. And the funny thing is, the official narrative about COVID is falling apart rapidly right now. In Britain, Israel, multiple countries, the vast majority of deaths are happening among the vaccinated. And it's getting weird. If you look at the recent John Hopkins study, which shows that masks don't work, lockdowns haven't worked, the whole thing is falling apart. It's an amazing thing. It came out just this week. And it's now that they're really cracking down on free speech, against the narrative, when the narrative itself has almost no backing in science. I mean, the science is now crumbling. So to me, it looks like desperation on their part. Now, Neil Young is a nincompoop who doesn't know any of this. He's just following the lead of other nincompoops.
I don't know that to be true. And so, I don't think he's some expert on this whole subject, but he is someone who, had polio early in life. He's had some involvement with things that would cause him to have some interest more than the average person, average rock star in the issue. And I don't think you have to, I don't necessarily impugn his motives other than his instinct is wrong here. His instinct is exactly wrong here. On Wednesday, we had the piece Pandemic Second Opinion. And maybe the most important part of this piece, go there. There's links to more information. Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin did a 5-hour hearing. I didn't watch it all. You didn't watch it all, I don't think. No. But you're welcome to. The beauty of it is that I'm glad he held it. And he had, who is it? Robert Malone, who's a doctor who has been, saying some things that other doctors have not said. I want to hear people who, especially people like this, who have all kinds of expertise, when someone is speaking who has that kind of expertise against the official narrative, it is in everyone's interest to let them speak and to hear them out. And either it's going to show us that, you know what, even people who have a tremendous amount of expertise can be wrong sometimes. If you shut them up, and that's if he's wrong, maybe he's going to be right. And then, oh, that's, thank goodness we let him talk. But if you shut him up, what message does that send? I'll tell you what message it sends to me as someone who doesn't have a medical license and who doesn't know all about this. It tells me that I can't trust you. And if the official narrative is knocking other people out of the way and silencing them, then I can't believe the official narrative. And that's, I think, you know, personally, I probably would have been vaccinated sooner had I not been so distrustful of the vaccination people, the government. And so this isn't, I mean, look, it's good to have an opinion. Hey, here's where the science is. And I think this, and I've studied this, and we can come to different opinions. But we're, in essence, I'm not even really getting there because I don't think I have the expertise and I've read enough to know that much about all of this. I just know that if you're silencing the people who disagree with you, I can no longer trust you.
Yeah, well, that's where I'm at, basically. To me, the sign of somebody who has a weak case is somebody who uses non-arguments to settle the case.
Right.
Whether it's blunt force or just simply shunning or spittle. The suspicion is there they don't have much of a case. And in my defense of the accusation of Nincompoopery upon Neil Young, my Nincompoopery case is largely that the more you know about and more you like vaccine technology from the past, like polio vaccination and so forth, the more you do, you should be very concerned then when the current vaccines are nothing like the vaccines that you took and saved your life. Because these vaccines aren't the same. In fact, they work on a very different set of principles. And there's some reason to believe now that trick they're using by fixating on the spiked protein isn't everything that trick is cracked up to be. And that's where we're going to, I think, see it fall apart, is that was a trick. It's never been done before. But by fixing on that one element of the coronavirus and then basing their whole therapeutics on that, and that applies as to the Johnson & Johnson as well as the mRNA technology, they may have, I think they've bitten off more than they can chew. And I think they've caused a lot of problems. So I'll see. But in the case of somebody like Neil Young, or anyone who's really a pro-vaccine kind of person, which I always have been, by the way. I've always been a pro-vaccine kind of person.
Yeah, I've never been anti-vax, although I've always had some willingness to kind of think that, look, I don't know, they may be right. Let's hear them out. But here's part of it though with Neil Young, and it goes. We'll talk later about Coca-Cola and Airbnb and Procter and Gamble and the folks who finance the Olympics, and you know, kind of the idea that you a lot of times want to say, you know, what we're gonna do this, we believe this, like Coca-Cola, for instance. They had a lot to say about the Georgia election integrity legislation, but not anything about any of the specifics of it, because I don't think they had a clue what any of it was about or had any real depth whatsoever. And I'm willing to believe that Neil Young may have had more depth, but I know this, I haven't heard any of it. And I'm not willing to just say, well, that's because Neil Young doesn't have any depth. And look, I'm not arguing that he does have a tremendous amount of depth and he did this because he studied it and, you know, he stays up nights worrying about, but I am willing to say that the media isn't interested in it either. We get no depth. We get no granularity. No, everything is big headlines. And yes, now we can hate the other side. And yes, we are wonderful. And it's, even if you're on the right side, it's the sort of discourse that's going nowhere. And it's all virtue signaling. and it's completely obnoxious. And of course, the reason it kind of comes up, when you're talking about the Beijing Olympics, here are companies that, because Republicans passed a law that you have 15 days of early voting or something instead of, more during the year in which we were in a pandemic, that's worth going after them in every way, shape, and form, which just incidentally probably helps you politically. But when China is sterilizing and murdering and torturing and raping and imprisoning and committing genocide, and it isn't their first, well, come on, it's sport. Because, of course, if you said anything, you'd lose money. It's all about money with them. And we have to, I kind of hate to always be the, not always, because I'm not always, but, in this day and age in which everything's an outrage and everybody's boycotting everything, you kind of hate to boycott. But we did a thing this week where we put out a video, The Real Thing. But the real thing wasn't Coca-Cola. We asked the question, what about the Uyghurs? And the real thing was genocide. It's the real thing. It is a time to stand up and say something. That's what we ended the week talking about.
I'll put up the video at the end of this video, but the audio podcast, there's no point in putting up that It's the Real Thing video on the audio podcast, because it really is a visual presentation. People can find it at Rumble, at YouTube, or pages there, and on Facebook. This is Common Sense.
Common Sense with Paul Jacob. Yes, I think it's worth embarrassing these companies about this complete double standard, and about, frankly, look, I'm less concerned about them engaging in politics in an obnoxious way in the United States of America, in which I have every way to fight back against them. Not every, but a lot. I'm more concerned with them whitewashing what is happening in China. And as I've said I've been on a tear about fear of China and the China-Nazis, because I'm convinced that they are Nazis. And it's an ethno state where Han Chinese are the top race and top ethnicity, and frankly they come first, and they are committing genocide. I mean, there's a lot of similarities. The concentration camps, they give that funny connection, and yet our society, and I've said from the beginning, I don't know exactly how we solve all these problems. It's not like we can just flip a switch and China becomes a free democratic country, or the United States, sails in and says, well, you'll do this and you'll do that. We're living in a very dangerous world, but not recognizing this enemy is foolish. And we're guaranteed not to find the answer to keep a lot of people free, including ourselves, ultimately, if we don't recognize what China is. And part of the importance in recognizing what China is as a government, Chinese people are like us, good. Unfortunately, like us, they have a rotten government, and theirs is a lot more rotten and dangerous and deadly. But our government, as we have said many times, certainly appears to want to behave more like the China-Nazis who are ruling China. And that's something that is, again, worth recognizing, because all of this free speech stuff we keep talking about and how the social media should be regulated and so on. Look, if you like that, go to China, because they're regulating it all night and day. And they're serious about it. They're not doing it Washington style, some bureaucracy that doesn't get stuff done. They're doing it the China-Nazi way. And so if you love that, you got it. And unfortunately, I don't think the Chinese people love it. I don't think all the people who are threatened by China, their neighbors, Taiwan, folks in Hong Kong who are already, I heard some report today where a lot of Hong Kong's freedoms have been diminished. A lot have been, it was like, they've got none. They have no political freedom whatsoever. It's like, I just think it's like you didn't want to say that. And oftentimes when I'm reading stuff about, and I've been saying this on this podcast and to you, whenever you would listen, Tim, that I read stuff and it's like, my goodness, in American politics, the new journalistic thing is we have to tell everybody what to think about it. But when it comes so often to reporting about China, it's couched in language that is hiding really serious stuff. Like rarely does anybody in the United States of America know that it's pretty well established that China for decades and decades has been using political prisoners as basically holders of organs they might want to extract and sell. And it goes on for decades and decades. And apparently, from most of the evidence, Western governments aren't interested, but in independent efforts, it appears to still be going on. The genocide against Falun Gong is completely. I went to a movie and it may write something about it because it is still showing in a lot of places in the country, but it's called Unsilenced, and it's a movie about the Chinese government. Falun Gong basically rose to be about 100 million people were considered themselves part of that spiritual movement. That was more than members of the Chinese Communist Party. And so all of a sudden, the Chinese Communist Party decided it couldn't exist anymore, and you were an enemy of the state if you practiced it, and went on a genocide against that religious sect. And by genocide, let's be clear, because we actually wrote a commentary about this maybe a year ago. Some former ambassador had said they shouldn't be using the term genocide. And then when pushed, said, well, you could call it a cultural genocide being committed against the Uyghurs. Not a genocide, but a cultural genocide. Well, genocide, you don't have to kill every member of a religious, racial, ethnic group for it to be considered a genocide. If you do things like sterilize them so that they can't reproduce, if you hold them in prison camps and beat them up all the time so they can't reproduce, if you browbeat them and punish them if they practice their religion, all of these things are going on. And all of those elements are genocide. Now, it is also true that it's more serious where, that they are killing people. And there have been all kinds of allegations of rape as a means of torture and so on. Look, when people believe they have the right to do any of this type of stuff, it's amazing how often they do it all. And that's what we have in China. And how do you stop that? How do you stop totalitarianism anywhere from encroaching? I mean, we thought, look, after World War II, wasn't it vanquished? Well, no, not really. And frankly, one of the things we talked about this, I think a week or two ago, when we had the Orwell quote about how fascinated intellectuals in the West are with totalitarian schemes. And he recognized that the key about Orwell was not his analysis of the Soviet Union. Anybody could have figured that out. I mean, it was just there in front of you. The brilliance of Orwell is his understanding of how the same impulse was alive and unfortunately well in the West. And that's what we're dealing with still today. And in fact, we're dealing with it a lot more, I think, today. I skipped some material here, which we don't necessarily have to go back to it all. But I should mention that one of the scripts that this week that I didn't mention previously was Gerrymandering Proceeds Apace. And I just wanted to mention it real quick because this is a story that's important to see through the media, smoke screens. Republican politicians are not your friend. Democratic politicians are not your friend. They will use gerrymandering. This is a story about New York State, and you're probably not going to hear it because, of course, most of the media is on the left, and this isn't a good story for the left, so you're not going to hear it. But they are gerrymandering districts there. They've overcome all kinds of attempts by the people to force some sort of redistricting commission that would do it without all the politics. Well, the only choice the voters had to enact such a thing was given to them by politicians, who, of course, created it in such a way that independent commission was not independent. It was completely partisan. And when they couldn't get the map that the Democrats wanted, they punted and sent it back to the legislature. It now looks like New York will go from 8 Republican congressmen to 3. Now, you never know, because there's actually elections, let's hope. And that may not be the case, but that's what the map tends to show. If people vote the party they did before in the precincts that they did before, that's what the map would create. It's why, first of all, single member districts don't have to be the way it is. If we had more districts and politicians were not so removed from us, their ability to gerrymander and play all these games would be much reduced, as well as the power of money. So there's all kinds of solutions for this. But I mentioned this. I didn't want to skip over it completely, because there's all kinds of talk about election integrity. There's all kinds of lies being told by the media that they're just ridiculous. And of course, if you know anything about any of these individual stories, you realize how big the misrepresentations are. But I wouldn't salute all of the bills that have been passed in the states. Most of them have been pretty reasonable bills. The scariest, as we have continually talked about it, this is commonsense.org, is the federal legislation that the media tells us is in response to what's happening in the states, Republican legislatures in the states, after what happened on January 6th. Now, the reality is virtually every word of the Democrats' congressional legislation was written and has been being pushed for 2-4 years before any of this. So to portray it as a response to what Republican legislators are doing in the states, well, is dishonest. That is the way it's constantly portrayed. So it's just, it's again and again, and it's important, I thought, to bring this out, because it's another case in which you're not likely to hear anything about it because it's happening on the Democratic side.
And I have friends who insist that it's only Republicans who want to mess with the voting system. For instance, gerrymandering. I have Democratic friends who says that's what Republicans do.
They all do the gerrymandering, and legally they're allowed to do it. The problem is, I think one of the reasons that gerrymandering is talked about as much as it is, you can only go so far through gerrymandering. And there are times where there's been gerrymandering where someone had a brilliant idea and it ended up costing their party. So it's not as if it's always as successful as it's portrayed, as the press is hyping what's happening. But it's a bad thing. It's not the key problem. The key problem is incumbents who don't really have to listen to you or to me, because we don't matter that much. And that's due to the fact that they build up more and more incumbency power. And it's due to the fact that, at least for Congress, the district that they rule over is 750,000 on average people. So if you call and say, hey, I don't like this or that, well, then you go through some program and you're stuck in this slot, they don't care. They don't care. You don't matter. You're one of 750,000 people. So you're upset. Bug off. And the difference is, a state like New Hampshire, in their state house, The average district is 3,000 people. Now, you're a legislator and you get a call from 7 people who are upset about a certain thing that happened and want you to look into some legislation that's been proposed. You're going to look into it. 7 people in a district that's 3,000. There's probably only 1,500 voting. These 7 people get 20 friends each. I mean, all of a sudden things have changed. 7 or 70 people call you in a district that's 750,000. It's a totally different game. So there are things that we've got to do to our political system, and reforms that have to get made. But almost all the reforms that are talked about and are brought forth by politicians are going to be pretty rotten reforms. And it doesn't mean that the people don't come up with some rotten ones too. One of the things, just since I'm on this tangent, that I like about small districts is that it makes a difference in campaign finance. I have always been big on the First Amendment. I don't want the government regulating everything that's spent, controlling everything. I don't think you ought to have lawyers and accountants to play in politics. And I see almost all the campaign finance reform making it difficult for folks like me who want to play in politics, but we're not exactly at the, we don't have enough billionaires behind us. I'm working on it, but and it doesn't stop the folks with money at all. Just not at all. It's just how many accountants? Yeah, here's the check. Go do it. And so I see that system, and yet I don't like people being able to have outsized influence because they can write a check. I think you're going to have some influence, and that's right, but you don't want it to be everything. You don't want political races where people don't know anything about the people, and therefore whatever they're hearing on TV is the sum total of what they know. In smaller districts, like in New Hampshire, you go into a house race there and you spend a bunch of money, people are looking at you like you're crazy because you're doing damage because they know that guy. They may not like him. They may be a Democrat. He's a Republican. I'm not going to vote for him. But don't call him a bunch of names because I go to the same church. I know he's a good guy. In that sort of politics, money is completely disarmed. And it's disarmed without taking anybody's First Amendment rights away. And so that ultimately is where political change ought to be going.
I'm going to ask the dumb guy question because I don't really know a lot about redistricting and gerrymandering. I mean, I've never studied this subject. But when you look at the problem, which is, the creating, splitting jurisdictions up in funny ways to get slivers of populations to vote, one party over another. I mean, that's the basic idea.
Right.
Why don't they just, a general rule like saying you can't split up a county unless it's above a certain population. So counties have to be in one district. They can't split up counties unless some county has this huge amount, so maybe one county gets split up 10 different ways, but all the other counties have to be maintained whole in a district. Isn't that a rule that could be made that would make sense?
Another way to talk about that would be compactness, that you're not wanting to split up. Like if you could make one city its own district, you wouldn't instead split it and make it part of 2 districts. You'd keep it compact.
Right.
And there's certain principles like that you could push. None of those are required by law, but you could pass a law that does require it. It's a little more complicated in actually making all those decisions, I think. Here's the other thing. People tend to live together in certain ways. For instance, one of the reasons, like in some of the elections, more Democrats got more votes and Republicans got more seats. And one of the reasons that is there are very few Republican districts in this country in which the Republican gets beyond 68% of the vote, let's say. Every district in New York City, the Democrat's going to get 80, 90% of the vote. And so in San Francisco, there are lots of Democratic districts where the winner is getting 80%. And you can go in and you could take different things to create districts where that's not as much the case. But of course, you can't district across state lines, so you can't really do away with that altogether. And so when you're doing that sort of districting, you could split it up, but that's even more drawing crazy lines that don't make sense. And I think there is something that we want people who have the same situation. You don't want to grab like half of a big city and then go way out into the rural area where you've got completely different interests in the people who are representing. And I think there's two ways to deal with that problem. One is to do multi-member districts, where even if you're not the biggest group in the bigger district now, you could get some representation. But I like smaller districts and more reps, no more money, more reps, but make them much more low paid volunteers, regular folks, and have that sort of ethic. And then you've got a situation in which you're not trying to split up some big city or grab a chunk. Every little tiny chunk has got their own representative. And this city that before the question, are they going to be part of two representative districts, or are they going to be their own? Well, now they've got 5 or 10 within their city. In other words, it's a lot more districts, because instead of that district being 200,000, it's 30,000. And what that would mean, of course, is you're going to have big legislative bodies. And there's a couple pie in the sky. No, we can't do that because, well, they can't all get together then. Well, they can all get together still, but they probably aren't as likely to get together for months, only together in a Capitol building and so on. Those times they get together are going to be for shorter intervals. And they're going to do more stuff online. They're going to vote more from their district. I think those are all good changes and smart changes. So there's a lot there. And there's a lot to, in essence, I think for people to think about that. We almost have to get to a society in which people can think about things and discuss them without the 5-minute hate, without the, oh, that's the bad guys and we hate them, and here's why that idea is really designed to, destroy our society. So it's the hope for like meaningful reform is in some ways just seems so remote. And yet the public, I've known since I worked with term limits in the early 1990s, the public is with us. The public wants this reform. The problem is finding some way to implement it. And that's a heck of a problem. But the support for serious reform and the concern that government is completely out of control is greater today than it was 3 decades ago. And frankly, because, and it shows the lack of success, government's more out of control. And especially, we see with the pandemic, I don't think anyone's going to give Joe Biden high marks on dealing with the pandemic. And of course, he's dealt with the easier part of it, it seems like to me, and nobody's going to give Trump high marks for dealing with it. And frankly, get past the political leaders, I don't give high marks to Anthony Fauci for dealing with it, or for the other people at the CDC or NIH. We have not gotten a competent, efficient medical, hierarchy to help us through this pandemic very well at all. And yet we have gotten all the authoritarianism that you might fear when stuff hits the fan and people are scared.
So you wrote 2 other pieces that you've not talked about.
I'm hiding that from people.
Okay, LinkedIn Red-Handed from Tuesday, another piece about social media and China, right? And then Nobody Cares on Friday.
Well, I did sort of deal with Nobody Cares, but we'll deal with that a little bit more. But the LinkedIn, I think, is, this is worth considering. That it's like on the littlest things that that LinkedIn basically is trying to hide the whole, fact that there's a best-selling book out called Red Handed. I'm actually reading it, not as we speak, but read some last night to begin it, and we'll be reading more of it. But it's about the collaboration between American elites and Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. And we again see LinkedIn, and we've seen them in several different places doing things like censoring stuff before China has asked them to censor it, and being somewhat not fully transparent about what they're doing. And in this particular case, I guess that what was so funny is that they basically alleged that Breitbart, which had had a story about it, that this was bullying China. And the idea that somehow somebody writing a book is bullying a government that's committing, their third genocide that we know of, it kind of shows you where a lot of big tech, we talk about big tech, we talk about big government, we talk about big medicine. There's something not good about big, and it's not the size, it's the lack of any accountability.
Well,
and then the last piece, Tim, just to cut you off, not let you say anything. I'm sorry about that. Nobody cares. We kind of dealt a little bit with the Olympics. We've been doing some things. We have a video. We've done some memes about corporate sponsorship of the genocide games. But we had a couple weeks ago, Chaimat Philip. I went to a video. I said this name like 3 or 4 times before we got on, but it's just, I'm doing it at the end now. So I've lost all of that, but it's Palapatia, I think.
Palapatia?
Yes.
Okay.
It's very that's odd. Close. That's close. Anyway, I did listen to a video. Of course, they may have been wrong. But anyway, he's was born in Sri Lanka. He lived in Canada and the US, has citizenship, I think, both places. Venture capitalist, billionaire, worked for Facebook. But he's the guy who came out and said, hey, nobody cares about the Uyghurs. And as we discussed, he was basically using that as people use it. Nobody really cares. They're not going to do anything. And what he meant was he didn't particularly care. At least it wasn't on his, the top of his concerns. And, maybe he feels like there's nothing that he can do. But I'm convinced there are things that we can do. And having some concern about stuff like this is a start. In this piece, we basically talk about what he's had to say and then what other folks have had to say about the Olympics. And I just make the point that, look, I had a friend who said, he's got somebody he knows who's in the Olympics and he's going to watch. And, I don't think somehow that he's facilitating, Xi Jinping and tyranny. I understand that. I had another friend who called me today and said, I drink Coke all the time. I'm not drinking any Coke. Look, do what you are moved to do. I'm just saying this is, Diet Coke. I see that. This is worth saying something about, doing what you can about, not being closed off about, because this threat is not just the Uyghurs' problem. It's all of our problem. In the same way that, I'm sure there were people who thought, look, they're complaining in Germany. What's the big threat? It became a threat. And when people talk about invading neighbors, when they talk about you'll be bloodied if you do anything we don't like, when you can't go to the Olympics without leaving your phone at home and bringing a burner phone because you can't trust the surveillance state you're going into, I think we're talking about a totalitarian regime. And I think we already know totalitarianism isn't good. And so anyway, but I thought there was one quote that summed it up to me, and that was Omer Kennett. And again, I have no clue that I'm pronouncing that even close to what you actually say, but he is the executive director of Uyghur organization trying to, wake people up. And he said, the specter of the Olympics cannot cover up genocide. It's hard to understand why anyone feels it's even possible to celebrate international friendship and Olympic values in Beijing this year. And I don't know how you argue with that. How do you go and celebrate? I love to celebrate, but there's nothing worse than celebrating something and realizing this isn't something that should be celebrated, that we have no reason to celebrate. It seems like Ayn Rand sometimes said something about that. I can't remember what it was, but there is something just wrong about always celebrating when there's no reason to celebrate. I think getting together with people from all over the world, and I've gotten an opportunity to do that in my life, is one of the things I cherish. And boy, that is worth celebrating. But if the cost of that is to go to some place where you're a pawn in some, dictator's nightmare, that's not something to celebrate and go, oh, what the heck? It's, let's have fun. Let's have fun. And I think the start of having fun would be to release a bunch of people in concentration camps in Xinjiang. Anyway, we should probably end this podcast on that wonderful note of freeing millions of Uyghurs. We don't claim that this podcast is going to free millions of people, but it's not going to hurt. And we're going to do what we can to not only remember what's going on in Southeast Asia, what's going on in the rest of the world, but to make certain that freedom of speech and political rights exist here in America. And those are not mutually exclusive things that have to be kept apart. Every time that we speak out about freedom in America, we are helping people all over the world. And every time that we speak out about freedom all over the world, we are helping people right here in America.
Well, very good. The place for people to go is thisiscommonsense.org. That's where they can find our Rumble page and the YouTube page where we have the video you've been talking about. Thisiscommonsense.org also has Steal This Meme, a little category up on top, which will have the video so you can easily see it. And from that page, you can also find the SoundCloud audio hosting page. But of course,
you can find everything. All roads lead to thisiscommonsense.org. And we do have the podcast now on Rumble and YouTube, so that it's on both when the skies are sunny, and when the clampdown comes, it'll be on Rumble.
There you are. And right after this on the video, I'll run the Real Thing video.
And for you listening on SoundCloud, go to thisiscommonsense.org and you can see it.
Very good.